Welcome back. Just going up to 7:30 here on Newsnight. Good to be with us. Now, top jobs in state-owned enterprises appear to be becoming even less and less desirable. Cash-strapped Eskom and SAA, as you know, over the past couple of weeks, having lost both of their CEOs. Well, Eskom's Phakamani Radebe announcing his resignation last week, citing health reasons. Just days later, enter SAA CEO and exit Vuwani Jarana, following suit shortly afterwards. Well, to find out why and what's making these jobs so undesirable, and also to look at the challenges faced by many of these CEOs, I'm joined by the Dean of Gibs Business School. It's a huge pleasure to have with us Professor Nicola Kleyn. Professor, good to have you with us.
Nice to be here, Gareth.
Thank you for your time. Why is it so difficult to keep these CEOs? The money's good. It seems the job title is fairly fancy. I'm sure you get to travel quite nicely, yet we can't keep them.
It's a tough job being a CEO in any context. And if you look at the track record here, what we've seen is CEOs moving across from the private sector into SOEs. Now, if we look at what it's going to take to succeed, you add in a whole other dimension of the policy game, the political game. You enter into organizations that have been substantively weakened over the last 20 years. You're expected to come in and do miraculous turnarounds when actually there's deep political uncertainty around those organizations. This is tough. It's not like you have only a knife to the back and a weight on the front.
Well, I was about to ask you if it's really just setting someone up for failure, but based on the fact you said you've got these unrealistic expectations, you're dealing with legacy political problems, are the expectations of these CEOs, and the timelines in which they're given to miraculously turn these SOEs around, is it just unrealistic? Is it as simple as that?
I think it's unrealistic unless you have everybody pulling in the same direction. And from what we can see around the two CEOs that are particularly in question tonight, we've got different reasons for standing down. But underpinning the organizations that they're running are similar issues. So they've come into institutions that have been hollowed out, both in terms of skills drain, in terms of corruption, state capture. What we've also got is CEOs that have come from the private sector who are well equipped to deal with private organizations or publicly listed organizations, but not reporting to government as a shareholder. So I think it's a huge ask. I think there's another thing that we need to take into account. These industries require significant technical knowledge to run them well. So when you take somebody from telecoms and you start saying to them, well, let's run an airline, and we take somebody from banking and we say to them, well, let's go and run our greatest power utility. Unless you've got all of the stars aligned, you're going to struggle.
So why are we putting them into place? If they clearly, it seems, coming from the private sector, possibly very different industries, where is the belief, the non-belief, the misbelief, misguided belief coming from that they can even succeed in these positions? Surely someone needs to sit back and go, we love you as a CEO where you are now, but we're setting you up for a highway to a hiding here, aren't we?
Well, I think we don't always want to believe that, and I think they tick, certainly as successful CEOs in the private sector or leaders in the private sector, they tick a number of boxes that we do look for in a CEO. So it becomes absolutely critical that you can think strategically, that you can mobilize people, that you can build stakeholder relationships. But I think the depth of expertise that's required, particularly to engage in the political sphere. So when you start reading the letters, and of course Mr. Jarana's letter was released, whether that was anticipated or not, I don't know, but we start looking at the relationships between the various ministers. We start looking at, you've got a plan that's set up with one ministry, and then another ministry says this isn't going to work. If you don't have a shareholder that's in agreement about what's required, that's a tough job.
Let me ask the uncomfortable question that any possible future CEO of an SOE may be asked and tasked with addressing. Does the country even need these SOEs? SAA is one that has been spoken about and bandied around for years now. Why do we need a national carrier? Let's deal with the SAA ones things first. Should its wings be clipped and packed away?
So it's a great question. It goes to the portfolio. I mean, we've got around 700 SOEs. I'm not an expert on SOEs, but that strikes me as being an extraordinary large portfolio that's filled with legacy issues, and in many cases these SOEs are bankrupt. There's absolutely no doubt that when it comes to Eskom, we are talking about the number one priority for the country. If the ANC had its lekgotla this last weekend and rolling into national policy States of the Nation address, if we're not talking about the fixing of Eskom as the number one priority for this country, we're missing the boat. But when it comes to a number of the others, I think there's fair play in terms of that. And there's no doubt that the time for putting national pride in your airline carrier is aside. So I think we really have to get quite brutal about what's essential to sit in the state and what would be better off either sold, closed down, and we need to find competent leadership that is ethical, that is going to be aware of the challenges around maintaining employment. So I'm not suggesting that we should be closing down SOEs and further exacerbating unemployment problems. But we really, really need government to have a strategy around these SOEs.
Is it an unkind, perhaps an even unfair question of me to ask if the next CEO for either of these two groups needs to come from overseas? Do we have that kind of CEO skill set, respectfully to the CEOs out there, to damage control and PR manage these two groups?
So I'm not sure whether we have to have CEOs that come from overseas. I think what certainly is required is to look for leaders who've been in these sectors, who understand the technical requirements of those sectors. And there is some bench strength in terms of that. What I do know is that we certainly need, sitting on the boards of these organizations and within the leadership cadre at the top, we need best practice expertise internationally. So I'm not suggesting that we parachute in management consultants who have a fairly poor legacy, actually, of addressing these things, if we think back to the Coleman Andrews days in SAA. But what there's no doubt we need is people who are going to collectively be aligned in terms of the shareholder, government, in terms of understanding the technical demands of their industry, and then in terms of having the capacity, the tenacity and the resilience to move forward.
As the Dean of Gibs Business School, if you were suggesting to government this evening, off the back of the Lekgotla, the ANC government that is, and also state government, President Ramaphosa, what do you think is a fair turnaround time to try and get, let's focus on Eskom. I think many people think there shouldn't be a national carrier, and we'll leave that aside for now. Let's talk about the number one priority that you suggested, and I'm sure many will agree, that being Eskom. What's a fair turnaround for a new CEO to come in? Because I don't imagine he or she can come in and say, I'm going to get this turned around in 2 years. They can't do it. What's fair? What's a fair timeline for them? If the President was listening to you tonight, Professor.
I'm going to tell the President that what I know about the dissemination, the generation, the distribution, etc., of electricity is dangerous. What we do need, though, is consistency of state policy. So if we turn around and say, what's a fair timeline, what government is going to have to be very clear on is what is the mandate given to the CEO? Because as with any CEO appointment, what you need is something consistent from your shareholder. We are certainly talking years, though. I mean, it took Eskom many, many years under far more favourable conditions to build up as one of the premium suppliers of electricity globally, both in terms of quality and in terms of cost. We've decimated that capacity. So we're not talking about a couple of years, but what we have to do first is stabilise, figure out what's non-essential, figure out also where we can actually split up, I think, the complexity of this enterprise, because there's no doubt that the value chain is exceptionally complex, and I think the conversations around splitting it into 3 different businesses need to be finalised and CEOs brought on with the right mandate.
Professor, it's a huge pleasure to have you with us. Thank you. Lovely discussion this evening. Dean of Gibs Business School, Professor Nicola Kleyn, joining us here on Newsnight. If you want more of that interview, in case you missed it earlier, no doubt, our online team getting that onto YouTube and eNCA.com in the next few minutes.